Good afternoon. Welcome to the FASEB webinar, Getting Ready for FASEB's Capitol Hill Day in DC and beyond. We have a few more participants logging in right now, so please bear with us. Thank you for your patience. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the FASEB webinar, Getting Ready for Capitol Hill Day in DC and beyond. Thank you so much for joining this afternoon anyway on the East Coast. My name is Ben Krinsky. I'm Associate Director for Legislative Affairs at FASEB. For this webinar, I'm also joined by my colleague Sybil Barnes, Assistant Director for Digital Communications here at FASEB. On the first slide you'll see here is just the agenda for today's webinar. We're going to go through several things about the upcoming Hill Day on March 7th. First, of course, our goals for Capitol Hill Day, how to prepare for Hill Day and what you will expect when you journey to DC. We will then go through FASEB's specific asks, that is what we would request that Congress do on behalf of biomedical and biological research. I'll then turn the microphone over to my colleague Sybil to talk a little bit about what we're calling virtual participation in Capitol Hill Day. That is how you can participate via social media and other means and be part of our advocacy efforts. And then hopefully we will leave a good amount of time at the end for questions and answers. So on that note, to ask a question, we have muted all of the audio lines just because it's too disruptive when people are trying to chime in on the phone. So we do respectfully ask that if you have a question, please use the interface on the GoToWebinar platform. There should be a window on your screens that looks something like this. Allows you to type in a question and you can just hit return and it'll come up on our end. And we'll keep a running list of these throughout the session and we'll be sure to answer them at the end of the presentation. So for those of you who are perhaps not as familiar with our organization, FASEB is a federation of 29 professional societies in the life sciences, spanning a very large breadth of research and education in biology and biomedicine. We currently represent, among those societies, about 130,000 researchers at universities, medical centers, and other research institutions across the nation and indeed across the world. Our mission statement is to advance health and welfare by promoting progress and education in biological and biomedical sciences through service to our member societies and collaborative advocacy. So just to give you a snapshot, this is just a logo showing all the societies that are currently a member of FASEB. So if you are interested, of course, in joining a professional society that is aligned with your research interests, we of course encourage you to join one of our many groups. So with regard to FASEB Capitol Hill Day, coming on March 7th, and a very generous thank you to all of you who will be participating in our Hill Day. We really see Hill Day as having both short-term and long-term goals. In the short term, of course, the Hill Day provides an opportunity for you to share information about biological and biomedical research happening in your home states and districts. There's this old adage in the political world that all politics is local, and that's very much true. And really the powerful thing about having scientists come to Washington for Hill Day is that you are able to share your stories about why the research and education activities you're doing are so impactful in your states and districts. Politicians really do care what the government is funding that is affecting them and affecting their constituents. To that end, we then in turn, of course, want to encourage those legislators to support robust increases in funding for the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, and other agencies that support basic research in the life sciences. However, we also see FASEB Hill Day as having long-term goals. We really don't want Hill Day to be a sort of a one-off activity for all of you. For those of you who have done this before, you know that Hill Day provides an opportunity for you to begin to develop relationships with your elected officials. And many of you now have those close professional, even personal ties with staff in your representatives and in your senators' offices. And this really helps you to be a better advocate for research and helps them because they can draw upon you as a resource and use your expertise to better understand why these issues are so important. And of course, in the very long term, this helps the members to understand the broad importance of biomedical science to their states and districts and indeed the nation. We want to be in a position where members of Congress are not simply signing the bills that fund these agencies, but really are themselves champions. We use the phrase cultivating champions a lot, and we want members of Congress to really understand why these investments in research and scientific education are so important. So, with regard to your preparation for Hill Day, first, you may want to familiarize yourself with your senators and representatives if you are not already familiar with them and their political positions. If you don't know who your senators and representatives are, that's okay. I'll say a few words in a moment about how to get that information. But we do encourage you to visit their websites, their Twitter feeds, and really just to get a sense of where they are politically. Even if they're not talking about science specifically, you can still get a sense of where they might fall on some of these issues. I want to say, and I want to highlight this point, FASEB will provide talking points, funding data, and other information when you arrive. So you don't need to worry about that. We will have extensive packets of information for all of you when you come to town. We will also, of course, as we do each year, have so-called leave behind packets. These are sets of information that we use as handouts we can give to members of Congress or their staff. So we will have everything that you need for your meetings when you arrive here in Washington, D.C. That said, we do encourage you to gather materials from your university institution that help to reinforce these messages. So, for example, brochures, infographics, press releases from your universities or medical schools, anything that continues to help tell the story about why these investments in science are so important. So again, we do encourage you to bring additional information that can help reinforce these arguments about the importance of science. If you do choose to do that, we ask that you bring several copies. 6 to 8 would be a good rule of thumb. That's just so that you can hand them out to congressional staff in your meetings and just have enough copies to go around. We also encourage you to prepare bullet points describing how your research improves health and or benefits patients, produces new knowledge, innovation, and supports jobs locally. In other words, like I said earlier, having you come to Capitol Hill is very powerful for legislators to hear your stories about research, about the advancement of health, about the advancement of science. And so this point here is just to encourage you to essentially outline your story ahead of time. Some of you have done this before or are very comfortable sort of speaking off the cuff, but this would just help to get you thinking about what you might say in these meetings and help keep things a little bit more organized. And I should also say it's important because the meetings you'll have on Capitol Hill are quite brief. So we want to make sure that we're making very pithy arguments for scientific research. In very bold letters on the bottom here in red, you'll see, don't forget your business cards. Washington, D.C. still is has a very traditional business culture. So if you do have business cards, we highly encourage you to bring them so that you can pass them out in your meetings. You will be exchanging business cards with staff in these offices. So for those of you who might not actually even know who your elected officials are, that's totally fine. We have a handy resource for you on our website. If you go to www.faseb.org and click on the Science Policy Advocacy and Communications link as shown on this page, you'll see there's a button called Legislative Action Center. This is actually where we put up e-action alerts when we call upon you to write letters or emails or call your members of Congress. But in addition to that, it has a nifty tool where it allows you, as you'll see here on the right, to actually put in your address information, which will give you information about who your elected officials are. So it'll ask you first for your zip code. It may then ask you for a street address. Feel free to use both your home address or your work address, the address of your laboratory, because sometimes you actually might have an office and a home in two different congressional districts. So you can put in your information and you'll get a readout that looks something like this. This, just as an example, is Representative Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut. She happens to be chair of the subcommittee that oversees the budget for NIH. So just as an example of what you'll see. Anyway, the tool will give you this kind of output, which describes a little bit about who the members are, their contact information, as well as links to their website and their social media feeds. So that's where you can really get a handle on where they fall on a lot of these political issues. So you might be asking yourselves, what is the environment on Capitol Hill? What's going on inside the Beltway? Well, it's never a dull moment in Washington, D.C. So I'll just go over a few things to keep in mind, sort of the big picture political context here. First of all, we have a new Congress. We had a midterm election in 2018, which obviously had a big effect on the political landscape. For the House of Representatives was, of course, taken over by the Democratic Party, but across both sides of the aisle in the House, we have a lot of new members. So 59 new Democrats, 29 new Republicans, with one seat pending. The Senate, of course, remains in control of the Republican Party, but there are 2 new Democratic senators and 7 new Republican senators. So one thing to keep in mind is that there just are a lot of new faces on Capitol Hill. And so this is really a wonderful opportunity for us. It helps us to begin that process of education, to inform these new members who, again, might not be terribly familiar with the federal research enterprise and federal funding for science, why these investments are so important. So that's actually something that's encouraging about your upcoming visit. Now on to the perhaps less than great news. Of course, there is split control of the Congress. As I said, the House is in control of the Democrats, the Senate in control of the Republicans. It's the first time that's happened since 2015. I think it's fair to say that given increased polarization between the political parties, there are really relatively few moderates left in either the House or the Senate. It used to be there was much more, and one way of measuring this is looking at crossover votes. There's more and more, fewer and fewer members of one party who will vote for legislation that is being sponsored or endorsed by another party, at least not on a lot of the hot-button political issues. Another interesting wrinkle to the current political environment is that House Republicans elected after 2010, the so-called Tea Party insurgency, that group of House Republicans who tend to be further to the right of the political spectrum, they've actually never been in the political minority. They've always been in the Congress up till now when the Republican Party had the majority. So it'll be interesting to see how they act and what their priorities are given the new political dynamics there. We are also confronted with the reality of a 60-vote threshold in the Senate. The filibuster is still alive and well. So again, large pieces of legislation require a 60-vote threshold, which, given the composition of the Senate, means that you need crossover votes from both Democrats and Republicans to get things done. So that's another reason why the term gridlock comes up a lot, because it's very hard for legislation to meet that 60-vote threshold. Congressional dysfunction has been on very prominent public display lately, I'm sorry to say. We are still recovering from the longest government shutdown in United States history. It was 35 days long. Fortunately, the Congress did reach a compromise to fund the remaining agencies of the federal government. So the government has reopened, is open for business for the remainder of the fiscal year. So a little bit of a silver lining there, but obviously it was a rocky road to get there. And once again, polarization really is still extremely strong. Compromise is really not something that is valued perhaps as it once was. There's not as much reaching across the political aisle. There are still some personal relationships. Members of the Senate in particular still generally there's a degree of comity between them. But compromise is not something we have seen a lot of in recent years. And just to make things even more interesting, the focus will be quickly shifting to the 2020 presidential elections. For those of you reading the news, multiple Democrats in the Senate have launched presidential campaigns. So there's a lot of presidential hopefuls out there making speeches and generating a lot of publicity. It's also important to note that there have been a couple prominent retirements announced in the Senate. Lamar Alexander of Tennessee and Pat Roberts of Kansas have both announced their retirements. So once again, we're looking for towards perhaps some big changes in the government after the 2020 election. With regard to funding or appropriations, as the jargon goes, just to want to give you an overview of where things are looking for the next fiscal year. Unfortunately, there will be a difficult road ahead. The spending caps and sequestration, which are enforced under the Budget Control Act or the BCA, those caps return in fiscal year 2020. Unfortunately, the spending cap, that is the limit Congress has imposed on itself for what we call non-defense discretionary programs, and that includes funding agencies for science like NIH and NSF. That cap decreases by $55 billion, or 9% below FY19. So in other words, as the law is currently written, less money will be available for these various programs across the government, including scientific research. This, of course, complicates the outlook for fiscal year 2020 appropriations bills. The members of Congress on the appropriations committees have to write bills, and they have to write them within whatever the caps are in law. Of course, there are members of both parties who really don't want to operate under these spending caps. They're both Democrats and Republicans have priorities for discretionary spending, and so we anticipate that another bipartisan deal is in the works, and certainly a deal will be needed to increase those caps and allow the appropriators to spend more money on these various programs. Conversations about raising the caps, the BCA caps for FY 2020 are just starting. We haven't gotten a sense that those conversations have moved ahead very far, but again, there will have to be an effort to raise the caps in order for more resources to be available. So this is a good segue to our asks, or what we will request on Capitol Hill Day. As I just alluded to, raise the caps will be a very prominent part of our message for these reasons. The Budget Control Act spending caps really do put onerous constraints on the amount of money available for scientific research and education programs, and therefore we will be urging Congress to come to an agreement to raise those spending caps and provide more resources for these critical research and education programs. So raising the caps really is the first step. The second message we want to try and bring, hopefully after we've persuaded them to raise the caps, is in turn to support stable, sustained, predictable growth for the federal science agencies in FY 2020. This is reiterating our message from previous years, but again, we want to make the point that science represents a long-term investment and that they need to provide robust resources so that these programs can flourish. Our request for the NIH in FY 2020 is $41.6 billion, and for the National Science Foundation is $9 billion. All right, so many of you have done these meetings on Capitol Hill before, and you know that these meetings, generally speaking, are pretty cordial and pretty friendly, although you can sometimes run into some awkward topics of conversation. And so this is just to give you sort of a primer of the kinds of things you might hear when you speak to congressional staff. So for example, you might hear someone say, quote, "The return of the budget cap is not good for NIH." To this, you might say, "We certainly agree," which is why we are encouraging Congress, again, to reiterate this talking point, to raise the discretionary spending caps and provide more resources for scientific research and scientific education. You might hear someone say, "The federal debt is growing. We have no choice. All spending must be cut." This is the sort of response you might hear that actually is a good illustration of what we call the pivot. This is something we emphasize repeatedly when we're prepping people for these kinds of Hill meetings. It's important not to get mired in sort of larger political fights or in other issues. For example, the disposition of the overall federal budget, or how the Congress might raise more revenues or cut other programs. If those kinds of things come up, what you want to do is as quickly as you can pivot back to our main talking points. So when someone says, well, all spending must be cut, you can say, well, we understand that there are these are difficult political times or difficult constraints on the budget, but we really believe that these investments in NIH and NSF are important for the long-term health and security and prosperity for the nation. So quickly transition away from the sort of bigger political fight back to our area of expertise, which is the scientific research agencies. You might hear something like NIH is a bipartisan priority. You don't have anything to worry about. Again, this is where you can say, well, thank you very much. We appreciate the support. However, and of course, you can also say we are very grateful that it has remained a bipartisan priority. But again, we are concerned about the fiscal outlook in 2020 because of the caps on discretionary spending. And again, this is where you can transition to discussing how important it will be to raise those caps and make sure that more money is available for NIH and these other agencies. Oftentimes we hear things along the lines of NSF needs to prioritize resources to fund the most promising research. This is a good opportunity. If you hear something like this, is a good opportunity, again, to educate members of Congress or their staff about how these agencies really go about their business. You can say, well, both NIH and NSF have very rigorous processes in place through merit review, through peer review. They evaluate proposals, and they find, indeed, the proposals that do have the greatest promise for real breakthroughs that will advance health or lead to new innovations and new great discoveries. So there's maybe a sense in some offices on Capitol Hill that NSF and NIH are just sort of throwing money out the door and that they're somehow wasting taxpayer dollars. But so this is an opportunity to say, well, actually, these agencies are very careful stewards of public money. They take their public missions very seriously, and they are doing everything they can to prioritize the most promising research. You might hear something like Representative X, Y, or Z supports increasing the NSF budget. She's not the problem. Again, you can say thank you very much. It's important to express appreciation. Say thank you very much for the representative's support. We really appreciate that she's a supporter of basic science programs. And this is where you can talk about how we are actually, just one group among many that are on Capitol Hill today. Say this is a part of a much larger effort where we have hundreds of meetings across Capitol Hill, and we're all just trying to bring this message about the importance of these programs. And also, this is where you can also say, well, we're very thankful for your support, and we just want to remind you how important these programs are, and just to keep them in mind when you're making these budgetary decisions going forward. You also might run into some real pessimists, some who might say nothing is going to get done this year. We could say, well, we're sorry to hear that the road is difficult and there is so much gridlock in Congress, but we really hope that in the coming months, members of both parties can come together to raise the spending caps, provide more resources, and ensure that these agencies have the predictable, robust, sustained increases in funding that they really need to support the nation's scientific enterprise. So in terms of logistics, here's some information about what you will expect when you arrive in Washington, D.C. First of all, you will be broken into small groups. Each group will have a guide who will escort you to all your meetings, so you won't be left to your own devices to find your way around Capitol Hill. You'll have an experienced guide who will take you to all of your meetings. All of you will have appointments. We are in the process of scheduling all of those meetings right now. And your appointment will be on their books, but when you show up to a particular office, you may be kept waiting. This is just the nature of Capitol Hill. There's always a lot going on. Staff often are falling behind schedule. It's not a slight towards you at all. It's just unfortunately the nature of the way things work there. So please do be patient, follow the lead of your guide. All of us have been to these meetings before and sort of know the lay of the land. Also, when you show up to your meeting, we ask you that you please turn off your cell phone. The meetings are very short. You have a limited amount of time, and you don't want to interrupt with a call or text message. As I just alluded to, you should expect to have about 15 to 20 minutes for each meeting. They tend to be quite brief. Just at the beginning, you can introduce all the participants. Just say your name and your institution and perhaps what professional society you're affiliated with. You don't have to give your entire CV or research career. Just a very brief introduction is fine. And then proceed and try and get to the message and our asks as quickly as you naturally can. Explain why scientific research matters to your state and district. This is where you can point to some of the information that we'll provide for you, and I'll say more about that in a moment. And this is where you can share your personal story. Talk about your research. Talk about the impact it's having. Talk about the promise you see for discoveries in your field in the days ahead. Offer to be a resource. Describe how your institution and FASEB can be of assistance. We sometimes forget that this is not a one-way street. We want to be a voice for the community, and we want to advocate very strongly for science. But we also want to be a trustworthy source of information that people on Capitol Hill can turn to if they want to know what's going on in the life sciences. If you don't know the answer to a question, that is perfectly fine. It happens all the time. You can simply say, I don't know, but I will get back to you with an answer. That is, again, a perfectly legitimate thing. And I'll say a little bit more about follow-up in a minute. One thing I would say is that if they ask you a question, pay attention to what they're asking. Sometimes when we're in these meetings, we're trying to stick to the script, and you sometimes maybe forget that you're actually having a conversation with another human being. So if you're too focused on sort of plowing through your talking points and you're not listening to the questions being asked of you, sometimes the conversation can get a little muddled and not very productive. So if they're asking you questions, try your best to answer them, but if you don't know, that's fine. Just say, I don't know, and we'll get you some more information after the meeting. Before the meeting ends, please present the Leave Behind folder. Again, FASEB will provide this. It's a packet of information about funding for their state or district, as well as some other information about the life sciences. And also, please do exchange contact information. Again, this is supposed to be a first step, a way of building relationships with your offices. Business cards are often exchanged at the beginning of the meeting, so that's fine. So at the end, you can simply say, thank you so much for meeting with us, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Regarding the information, as I've said a couple times, that we will provide for you in your information packets, both the ones you'll carry with you to each meeting and also the ones in the Leave Behind folder. We will have updated information on funding to every state and district that you'll be going to. So this is a great way of showing the impact of NIH, NSF, and other scientific research agency funding, just to show how many of these dollars actually go directly to the members' constituents. And then in addition, we will have an updated set of federal funding recommendations. As I already mentioned, our recommendation for NIH this year is $41.6 billion. NSF is $9 billion. So we'll have a full color brochure version of these recommendations, along with additional information about the agencies that you will have to use in your meetings as well. So a quick word about troubleshooting. Again, this is under the category of what might happen in your meetings. You get the blank stare. So sometimes the person you're meeting with, often their staff, and they might not seem terribly engaged. You have to keep in mind that these folks are extremely busy. Individual staff members have a very broad portfolio. They're not just focusing on biomedical research or even on science. They often will have very diverse portfolio, covering anything from labor issues to agriculture to healthcare, sort of anything under the sun. So it may be that they're just distracted because they have other things on their mind. Just be patient. If they really don't seem to be engaging, try and maybe segue the topic of conversation a little bit. If you've been, for example, talking about health, maybe talk a little bit about technology or innovation, or maybe something that will kind of get them a little bit more engaged. Your meeting takes place in a loud hallway. Unfortunately, this is just the nature of meetings on Capitol Hill. There's very limited space, particularly on the House of Representatives side. Again, our apologies that the meetings sometimes are in the hallway and it seems a little bit chaotic, but just be patient, bear with the staff member, and your guide will give you sort of guidance. Just essentially be patient and do your best. And again, meeting in a hallway is not in any way, should not be construed as an insult from the office. It's just the crazy logistics of Capitol Hill. Similar to the blank stare, the person you're meeting with keeps checking his or her phone. Again, these people they're not, it may seem rude, but again, these people are juggling so many different commitments. It is hard for them to keep up with everything that's going on Capitol Hill. So that's where, again, you could just try to be polite and then try to move the conversation in a direction where maybe they're a little bit more engaged and a little bit less prone to check what's going on their phones. The person you're meeting with doesn't appear to know anything about NIH, NSF, or scientific research in general. This is actually, it might seem like an awkward situation, but it's actually an opportunity. Again, these staff members, generally speaking, they're very bright and they're very engaged, but they're not necessarily scientists, and they don't necessarily know much about how federal scientific enterprise works. So if this is the case, it really provides an opportunity for education. So if you, for example, began the conversation just sort of plowing ahead with a description of your research or your very specific research area, if it seems like they really aren't quite following, it might be a good opportunity to back up and talk a little bit about the agencies in general, what they're funding, and then how that supports your work, your research, et cetera. The aide might not know their boss's position on the issues being discussed. That's okay. You can just say, well, we understand that you are juggling a lot of different priorities, and that the member might have decided on certain issues, but and this is again an example of a pivot where you can pivot back to our main talking points about how important it is that Congress raise the spending caps and provide more resources for science. Also, on the pivot point, someone brings up an unrelated issue. So again, because they have a lot of things on their minds, the staff are human beings after all, and something else might occur to them. So for example, if we're talking about spending, then they might want to start talking about tax policy. I think it's important that we don't get mired in a conversation in another policy area where we really don't have a lot of expertise or an organizational position. So again, I'll say the word again, pivot. At that point, you can say, well, we understand that there are these other issues involved and that Congress has many priorities, but we're here to talk about scientific research and the importance of these investments in the life sciences. All right, so I just want to say a few words about follow-up. I mentioned it's okay to say, I don't know, it'll follow up after the fact. Please do follow up. Send thank you notes. Email is best. After Capitol Hill Day, we will provide, that is FASEB will provide suggested language, so you'll have a template to build upon. You can add your contact information and your own personal touch to that, of course. Include any follow-up material or information that you promised. You can, include links to online documents. We do recommend that you avoid sending large PDFs or large files just because the email systems in Congress are not necessarily equipped to handle very large amounts of data, but do include that information that was requested. And then again, this is supposed to be the beginning of a conversation. It's a two-way street. So if there are anything that staff members want, we're going to provide to you. For example, maybe a clarification about where the member is on these issues. You can ask for that as well. Again, these people are there to serve the constituents. And they'll be more than happy to get back to you with information about where the member of Congress is on these political issues. If you do run into any real problems or concerns or questions, please report those from the meetings to FASEB staff. There may be things, again, on sort of the political front or things which you might not feel comfortable responding to yourself. So feel free to ask us questions. We're happy to help you with this correspondence and also find additional information as needed. So with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to my colleague Sybil to talk a little bit about social media and participating in Capitol Hill Day outside of DC.
Thanks, Ben. So as Ben mentioned, I'm Sybil Barnes, and I wanted to take a few moments with you today to talk about if you're not going to be in DC for Capitol Hill Day. You know, you can still do your part. There's a virtual aspect to this because you can turn to social media. I'm gonna focus and hone in on Twitter for our talk here today. You know, practically every congressperson has a Twitter account that either they or their aides follow and use. So sharing your thoughts on Twitter will help reinforce the face-to-face messages that they'll be receiving on March 7th. So how do we do that? Well, you can follow these 3 steps. So you can follow FASEB.org on Twitter. We will have a tweet storm that day, and you can retweet a lot of what we're saying. You can also follow along on the hashtag #RaiseTheCaps, and you can retweet comments on people who are using that hashtag as well, or actually, you can add to the conversation yourself by tweeting your own content and tagging it #RaiseTheCaps. I want to spend just a few seconds on the importance of the hashtag. A hashtag is simply a way for people to search for tweets that have a common topic. And in our particular case, just like Ben has been talking about raising the caps, we are using the hashtag #RaiseTheCaps for the day. You know, we all know there's a lot of noise on Twitter. So when your colleagues are meeting on Capitol Hill, they're going to be talking about raising the caps, and this will be reinforcing what they're talking about. And this hashtag is how we're going to be able to track awareness and track your responses. So remember, if you tweet, please include the hashtag. And if you don't include the hashtag, we may not see it. So you don't want your efforts to go to waste. So taking a deeper dive into your Twitter use, here are some pointers to keep in mind. If you want to be sure your elected official sees your tweet, make sure that you're tagging them. And by tagging them, I mean include their Twitter name in the tweet. Like I said, practically every elected official has a Twitter account. You'll find their Twitter names on their website, or you can use the Legislative Action Center that Ben showed you earlier. I'd even take it a step farther and add the name of the city in the tweet for extra measure, just as a clue to the official that you're trying to reach that you're one of their constituents. The second tip is keep it simple. Remember to keep your eye on the goal, and your goal is for the elected official to see you as the trusted and respected constituent. You know, we all know Twitter can be an evil place. It's, filled with a lot of negative comments, and nothing can bring this out better than politics. So avoid tweeting negative comments about anyone. Remember that pivot that Ben mentioned earlier, because you don't want to diminish your Twitter presence. Tell your story. This has got to be one of my favorite tips. Just as Ben mentioned earlier, to tell your story in person, well, you can also tell your story on Twitter too. Last year, Twitter had they had an increase, and so you now have about 280 characters to tell you the story of the research of your, you have about 280 characters to use to talk about your research. So if you've got an interesting story to share, by all means, share it. And don't be afraid to let your personality show through in your tweets. You can even include photos if you want to draw attention to what you're talking about. Remember, you're trying to be the credible source for them, so you can show them. Also try to tweet facts. I can't stress the credible part enough. Staying credible means sharing quality information. So you just want to share facts, not fiction. It will help your efforts if you link to the federal funding recommendations page that Ben had mentioned earlier as another way to lend credibility to your request for them to increase their funding. Also, include a call to action in your tweets. Remember to tell your official what it is you want them to do. Whether it's raise the spending caps, visit your lab, provide more resources for your program, whatever it is, just be sure that your tweet says it directly. And then also, as Ben mentioned, to do in person, also do it on Twitter as well. If you're finding that you're interacting with an official on Twitter, remember to say thanks or to express your disappointment in their position, but do it in a civil way. So this is usually the point where some of you may be wondering, okay, this all sounds interesting, but what do I tweet? Well, you've got about 2 weeks to give some thought to this, and so I'm going to try to jumpstart your thinking. So how would you answer some of these questions? For instance, why is Capitol Hill Day important to you? Why are we doing this? If you could be in D.C. with your colleagues, who would you tweet? Who would you meet with? That's the person that you want to tweet to. And what would you say? Tell them, how would you tell them science is important? How would you say federally funded research impacts everyday life? What examples would you use to point this out to them? How would you tell them your research improves health or produces new knowledge? Or how does your research support new jobs? Again, you want to be able to tell your story. So here's how answers to some of those questions might look in terms of content. I want to point out a few tactics that I've alluded to. Pay attention to the words that are in bold particular. So let's look at the first sample tweet. Here's an example of tagging the elected official. That's where I have name in the tweet. I've also incorporated the hashtag #RaiseTheCaps, and in this first one, I've even included another popular hashtag for the day, which is Fund Science. You want to be able to provide valuable information. So in this particular one, I've included a link to that annual federal funding recommendations webpage, and I've added the city that the person is in to show, again, you want to be able to clue in that elected official that you're a constituent in their district. In the second one, it also includes the #RaiseTheCaps hashtag, but I've also included a different hashtag in this one, and that's the 116th Congress. You can get creative in the use of your hashtags. #RaiseTheCaps is the primary, and that's going to be the focal point, but that's not to say that you can't add other additional hashtags to your tweets as well. And then the third example is an example of how you can tell your story. This is a very general one, but you can drill down and get much more specific. Again, it's including the #RaiseTheCaps hashtag, tying it all together, and tagging the elected official and including your name. And then, finally, this is not a one and done. If you are looking at using Twitter to post one tweet during the day, then you're not using Twitter to its fullest potential. Conversation is a two-way street, even when you're online. You can look for those who are making similar points as you under that #RaiseTheCaps hashtag. You can retweet some of their tweets. You can even comment on some of their tweets. But remember, the more you engage professionally with the community and the elected officials, the more the FASEB message will move forward and the more credible you're going to become. Just as Ben mentioned at the end of your face-to-face meeting, if you're on Twitter and if you've been interacting with an elected official or one of their aides, don't forget to say thank you. It's really important, and don't have that be just the end of the road for you. Don't make it a dead end. Tweet out an invitation to have them come see your lab, or send them more information about your work. But try to keep some way in which you can keep them engaged. And then finally, whether you're on Capitol Hill or if you're virtual, advocacy and social media are becoming the fabric of our life. It's the way we're living now. Policymakers and their staff are starting to expect and even welcome, and I want to say appreciate input from their constituents. So I encourage you all to use March 7th as a great way to reach out, especially on Twitter, to show your expertise and your perspective. And I guess that's it for right now, and I hope to see you all on Twitter.
Great. Thank you very much, Sybil. Obviously, we're really excited about our social media presence and getting more people engaged in not just here in Washington, but around the country and virtually. All right, so we're going to transition now to the question and answer session of the webinar. So for those of you who have typed those into the Q&A tool on the GoToWebinar platform, we are just getting that opened up on our end so we can begin to address some of your questions. Let's see here. So one of you asks, in answer to comment about prioritizing resources, can we describe how challenging it can be to get funded as scientists? Yes, this is definitely a great point you can raise in your meetings. We do encourage you to talk about the data and statistics that reflect what the agencies are doing. So for example, if you want to talk about how low funding rates are, and therefore how difficult it is to get funded, that's certainly a very valid topic to bring up, and is one of the reasons why it's important that these agencies receive funding increases. Again, you can speak about that from a personal perspective, or if you've worked with the agencies and you're familiar with sort of what goes on at the different institutes and centers. I also want to say a comment I meant to say earlier about prioritizing resources and making sure research goes to the most prominent areas. This is also an opportunity for you to talk about the specific institute and center at NIH that funds your research, if you're an NIH-funded investigator. So again, the idea that somehow NIH is just throwing money at problems that aren't really problems, that's where, if you get a comment along those lines, you can talk about why the structure of NIH, for example, that there are institutes, the National Cancer Institute, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, and so forth, that are actually dedicated to advancing particular areas of health and particular areas of medicine. So again, those are also things that you can talk about in your meetings. But yes, challenging to get funded, and the younger generation too. It's important. Another message that we bring to Capitol Hill frequently is how difficult it is to get started as an early career scientist. And so there again, very low funding rates and restricted resources make it very, very difficult for sort of the best and brightest young scientists to get established as scientists. So that's another dimension as well. What is the recommended attire for Hill Day? Oh, it's a great question, an important one I neglected to mention. The Capitol Hill and Washington, D.C. in general, again, has a very, or I'd say pretty conservative business culture, and that applies to dress as well. So we do encourage you to wear business attire. So for men, that would be a suit and tie, or at least a sport jacket and a tie. Basically, what you feel comfortable in going to a more formal meeting. So we do encourage you to sort of dress in a business-oriented way for your meetings. We ask, will this information be shared? This webinar information be shared afterwards? Yes. For all of you who are participating in the webinar, we will be circulating, we're recording this, and we will be circulating it to all of you who have signed up as participants. We will also post the recording as a video on YouTube at some point in the next several days. So stay tuned for that. So you will be able to go back and review all the information that we've covered today. All right, so a box just popped up that says, is this how we send questions? If so, how should we handle it? Yes, so, will we be encountering the press? And if so, how should we handle it? Okay, so yes, your question came through, so the Q&A function is working. On the question about the press, typically there are not reporters in your meeting. The meetings will just be you, your guide for the day, so one of the staff members from FASEB or one of our societies, as well as the staff member you're meeting with, or potentially even the member of Congress themselves. They are closed-door meetings. They are not open to the public, and they are also considered generally to be in confidence. So you should. It is an opportunity for you to have a frank conversation about these issues. So no, you're not going to be on the record, as they say in the press. Okay. So let's see, some other questions coming in here. Will FASEB be providing voting records for senators and representatives that we are meeting with on Capitol Hill? That's a great question. So the answer is yes. We will have an information sheet about the members of Congress you're meeting with that gives a little bit of information about how they voted recently on issues of scientific funding in particular. And so, again, if you don't have an opportunity to review this information on your own before Capitol Hill Day, we will have sort of a cheat sheet, a short bio sheet for the members of Congress you're meeting with. Let's see. My senators generally are favorable to funding science, but tend to vote on anti-science policies. Can we encourage them to listen to scientists to help them with their decision making? I would say absolutely yes. I think you can talk about how what the funding, of course, enables and how that supports the progress of science. And then you can talk about, of course, other sort of related scientific issues and how it's important to encourage sort of the growth and development of the scientific enterprise in general. Will the press be covering Capitol Hill Day? We are doing all this, the social media outreach and so forth. I don't believe we have any contact with the press at the moment who are going to be covering Capitol Hill Day as a news story per se. But we will, of course, be trying to get the word out through our media channels as much as possible. Will we meet with the members of Congress or just their staff? Another really good question about sort of how these Hill Days generally operate. Generally speaking, you will be meeting with staff. The reason is the time demands on the members themselves are very great. They are running back and forth across the Hill, going to various other meetings around town. They have lots of votes, lots of procedural votes and so forth. Often they are traveling back to their home states and districts. And so you will generally be meeting with staff. Once in a while, the member might drop in. That has happened on our Capitol Hill Days before, where the member comes in to say hello, and that actually is a great opportunity to engage with them directly, and also do things like take a photograph. We want you to do things like take pictures and sort of share the events of the day on social media. All right, I'm an NSF-funded researcher. We'll be talking about NSF funding on March 7th as well as NIH. Absolutely, yes. We have funding recommendations for both NIH and NSF. We are encouraging all of you in your meetings to talk about why both of these agencies are critical for the advancement of life sciences. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us about if you want to talk about one agency or the other and you're perhaps less familiar with it, we'd be happy to provide that information. All right. I'm really bad at Twitter. Will FASEB be tweeting throughout Capitol Hill Day so that we can just retweet, or is it better for me to add my own content? I believe we will be, but I'll let Sybil say a little bit more about social media.
So the answer is yes to both. Yes, FASEB.org will be tweeting the day. It will be a tweet storm that we're going to do. By all means, feel free to retweet FASEB's account. And you can even add your own commentary to the tweet when you retweet it. So you have the option to do both. If you want to simply retweet, that's okay. I mean, the whole goal for this is to get exposure and to have people amplify our messaging. So yes, you can just get by with just retweeting.
Okay, great. Let's see here. When is an ideal time to take or ask to take a photo during your meetings? I would generally say towards the end of the meeting. It certainly is, they expect this, the staff, members themselves as well as staff actually both get these requests a lot. So I would say as the conversation begins to wrap up, I would just at that point politely ask, is it okay if we take a photo? Usually you can get a photo with staff members sort of out by the nameplate by the member of Congress, so you know which office you've been meeting with. Okay. For those of us who are coming to Hill Day in DC, is there a way we can get our scheduled meetings in advance so we know we are going to be talking to? So we are still finalizing those schedules. That information will be circulated to you basically as soon as we have it finalized. But unfortunately, meeting requests and so forth are still sort of up in the air. So we will, for those of you who are coming to DC on Hill Day, don't worry, we will get that information to you in as timely a fashion as we can. Let's see. I participated in Capitol Hill Day last year, had great meetings with several aides who are very knowledgeable about NIH. What can I say this year so I don't sound like a broken record? Well, that's a very good question, and kudos to you for participating in Capitol Hill Day and for developing relationships, as we were alluding to, with the staff in these offices. First, I would say a few things to this. First, the political circumstances are different this year. To sound like a broken record myself, we are bringing this raise the caps message as strongly as we can this year. So talking about reaching a new budget agreement will be a very central part of the conversation. That's something that might not have come up in past years, or at least not last year. On the scientific front, you can also talk about new areas or new developments in your research, or new things that are exciting that are going on in your lab or on your campus. So just providing them with an update, even if you don't have to sort of start at square one to tell them what NIH is doing. They would love to hear, I'm sure, about the new and latest cutting-edge things going on in your scientific work. And if the aide is particularly knowledgeable about one agency, for example, NIH, you might be able to take that opportunity to talk about the National Science Foundation, or another one of these agencies that FASEB tracks, and why its investment is so important. We're really trying to encourage you to have these conversations that are a bit more holistic about the federal investment in science. That it's not just about one agency, but there's actually a whole spectrum of agencies that fund critical areas of life science research. So again, if you're focused on one agency, it might be an opportunity to talk about others. There's one small political caveat to that, which is that the staff member you're speaking to may be focused on one specific policy area. So in other words, you may be talking to the NIH staff point person, not the NSF point staff person, but saying some good words about these other science agencies never hurts. All right. A logistical question. You said to bring business cards, but my institution doesn't provide them, and I don't think I'll be able to order anything online before I come to DC. How important are business cards? Well, as I said, exchanging business cards usually at the beginning of the meeting is sort of customary in DC, but that said, if you do not have business cards, please don't worry. It's not the end of the world. The meeting will still proceed. You won't be turned away. Everything will be fine. And if the staff, for example, request a business card at the outset, I'm sure someone else in your group, either another one of your visiting colleagues or the group guide will be able to provide that sort of information. So please don't worry about it. The member of the staff who meets with you also will probably provide you with a business card. So if you do want to follow up via email, even if they don't have your information, you should probably receive theirs, and so you can send them a note thereafter. Okay. Let's see, one or two more here I think we have time for. You recommend that we prepare bullet points about our research. Is that something we should print out and bring with us to DC? Yes, actually, I think that would be that could be helpful. I think the advice I was trying to convey was not necessarily sort of overthink what you're saying, but just sort of outline and try and jot down a few thoughts about what you'd like to cover in the meetings. It's just so it's supposed to be a tool to help you sort of think about what you would like to say. If you want to bring notes with you, that's totally fine. You'll have, as I mentioned, a packet of information that FASEB will provide for you as well. So it wouldn't be awkward for you to refer to that. I don't recommend simply reading a speech or a script. You are in a conversation with someone on a one-on-one or a small group together. But yes, bringing notes is totally fine. Will we be in the same group all day? Yes, the answer is yes. We do try and put together members of the groups from the same state, or sometimes from a couple of states, generally from the same region of the country. Again, it depends upon, it varies a bit year to year depending upon who comes from what part of the country. But yes, you will be with a group of colleagues for the duration of Capitol Hill Day. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one last question. So let's see here. Can I call the local office of my representative, or can I call the office of my representative to request a meeting for Hill Day. No, please do not reach out on your own to schedule meetings. We are working very hard, very diligently to put together your schedules, get everything set, and it really helps actually both us and the offices on Capitol Hill if there aren't sort of multiple requests floating around just for logistical purposes. So we will put together the groups and make sure that your schedules are settled with all of your representatives and senators when you arrive in Washington, D.C. Okay, I think that's all the questions that have come in on our end. So once again, thank you so much for participating in today's webinar. We really appreciate your attention. I want to say another thank you to Sybil Barnes for all of the great work she's doing on social media and extending the reach of our advocacy efforts. Yes, we look forward to welcoming many of you to Washington, D.C. For Capitol Hill Day. Have a great day.